Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Tips and Tools for Facilitating MBTI Feedback webinar. My name is Kim Rivera, Associate Marketing Manager here at CPP, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and during the presentation, Michael will pause for questions throughout the webinar, so start thinking about what you may want to ask, and please submit them to me at any time using the question function in the webinar controls. Please note this webinar is being recorded and we'll be sending out an email with the link to the recording in the next few days. Now, I'm very happy to welcome our speaker Michael Segovia. Michael is a credentialed MBTI Master Practitioner and lead facilitator for CPP's MBTI certification program. Michael also facilitates CPP's FIRO and Strong certification programs, as well as customized in-house workshops working with clients in the entertainment, research and development, hospitality, technology, communications, security, legal, healthcare, and education industries. So let's get started. Welcome, Michael. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Kim, and hello, everybody. I hope there are several familiar people listening today, people that I've worked with over the last several years. You see, I've been with CPP and worked with the Myers-Briggs for a good number of years. I also recognize there are a good number of people listening who can add to this conversation, your level of expertise. So please do think about what you would add to the discussion today. Feel free to add in any questions, and we will set up some time to go over those questions and hopefully together get some really good answers. So our objectives today, one is just to refresh your skills on providing individual MBTI feedback for both the MBTI Step 1 and Step 2. Now, I want to be really clear, we're refreshing your skills here. For people who are brand new to the MBTI, there's a wonderful 4-day MBTI certification you can attend that covers all of this. We're just refreshing your skills here. We're also going to learn about a few new tools that can help you apply the Myers-Briggs type indicator, tools that maybe you've never even seen, tools that I'm only beginning to use that I'm really excited to get to share with you. And then again, opportunity will be provided so that you can ask any questions around challenges or maybe issues you faced using both the MBTI Step 1 and the MBTI Step 2. So let's start with MBTI Step 1 feedback. Now, when we talk about MBTI Step 1 feedback, there's a process that those of us who are certified know we need to make sure we follow. Now, of course, when we follow this process, we add our own sort of flavor to how we're delivering that feedback. So it's not going to be exactly the same by each person, but we do know there are certain steps we need to follow, starting with checking in with the client, and then giving an overview of what the Myers-Briggs type indicator really is, introducing what do we mean by the word preferences, then having our clients go through that self-estimate, and not until then, having your client take a look at their reported type, putting it all together, where in the end the client decides best fit type, and then that client would leave that individual session with you with an individual commitment to action. What things, I like 3 things you're going to work on based on the session they've had with me. So let's look first at a few recommended tools that I want you to know about. Hopefully everybody is very aware of Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type. That's the upper left corner on screen. This used to be called Introduction to Type. It has been refreshed for people who aren't familiar with this. And inside the front cover, there's a nice code that allows clients to then go online and explore this information in more depth. There's a little bit of information related to type and stress as well that isn't in the print version of this product. And I will tell you, every time I get feedback with a client, I use this booklet with every single person. It is also available in a PDF. So if I'm giving feedback over the phone, this allows me to give feedback, sending that PDF during that feedback session so the client and I can work together with this. Going on the same screen, on the same image, far right, there's Exploring Your Myers-Briggs Type Workbook. And I'm gonna, as we go through our session today, show you how I would introduce pages from this workbook in an individual feedback session. This, just like Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type, goes back with the client after the feedback session with you, because you're going to share lots of great, valuable information when you're giving feedback, but honestly, how much will that client remember? And so these 2 tools are really good resources for a client when they're done working with you to read, to access, to study, so that the understanding of their Myers-Briggs preferences is an ongoing experience. It's not just an hour, they leave, and then they don't remember anything further. What I want to emphasize before I move on is a brand new product. It's these are the MBTI Step 1 feedback cards. And this is, I kind of describe this as magic in a box, where you as a practitioner would get to use these cards over and over with various clients. So these are your cards to keep, to help clients walk through feedback where they have prompts and questions you can explore. And so again, I'm going to show you how you would add all of these different products into a basic feedback session. So as I go on, let's just go through our process, our steps, if you will, starting with that step 1, which is about client check-in. And you can see on screen, exploring your Myers-Briggs type workbook is a great place to do that. Pages 2 and 3 of the workbook, where you get really clear with the client around what the MBTI, what they expect to get out of the instrument, what specific areas they want to work on, and maybe how they might ultimately use this information to explore how to become more effective, productive people in work and life. When I'm doing check-in, it's also a great opportunity to really get into what was the mindset that client was going through when they answered the questions. It's crucial before you get into even talking about what the MBTI is all about, to talk about what was your mindset. Because ideally, when people answer questions on the MBTI, we want them to be in what we call their shoes off self, where they are, as much as possible, removing roles and expectations from work and removing roles and expectations from home, and just answering how they prefer, as if they had nothing and no one to answer to. Those are really good words to think about. So when I invite people to take the MBTI, I want them to answer the questions with the mindset of shoes off self, as if you had nothing and no one to answer to. And when you're checking in with the client, this is a great place to do that. The workbook allows you to add information related to all of that. But again, that mindset is crucial. In fact, it's really required whenever you start to get feedback with the MBTI. Then when you start giving an overview of the assessment, there are many great resources that can help you. For example, I like using Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type. Page 1, you'll see there's a nice introduction there. So if you're new to type, if you were just certified last week and you're trying to remember, well, what do I say about the MBTI? I know we covered it, and what do I say about Carl Jung? And what do I say about Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers? You're seeing on this page in Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type, that language is all there for you. You know, if you're me, when I start to get nervous, I say too much. What's nice is this helps focus so that I'm not overwhelming that feedback session with my client and just covering what I need. It's giving me those concise, clear words to describe in a consistent way basically every time. Then, of course, before we even get into what are MBTI preferences, we need to clarify what do we mean by preferences at all. We're not talking about traits. We're not talking about skills. We're not talking about abilities. We're talking about a preference for one side over the other, of course, recognizing we all use both sides, but just a preference for one side over the other. And so many of us have used the handwriting learning task where we ask you to sign in with your preferred hand and then use that same pen or pencil and sign in with your non-preferred or the other hand, and then just get some feedback about what was it like to use that preferred and non-preferred side. And what's nice is the Exploring Your Myers-Briggs Type Workbook, pages 4 and 5 and even 6 allow you to explore some of that information. You can also do this in Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type. There's a page there, page 4 of that booklet. And in the Personal Impact Report, a more extensive report, there's an opportunity to include information there. So many places, I like using the workbook because it's sort of that hands-on sort of way to apply type, and then that's a resource the client can take back with them and remember that whole understanding of what do we mean by preferences. And that's all we're talking about with the MBTI. We prefer one side over the other, recognizing, of course, we all use both sides. Now, of course, before you give anybody their reported results, there's another step you have to follow. We're on step 4, and that's the self-estimate, a crucial part of giving feedback. We never, ever, ever want to have somebody take the MBTI and then right away say, here you go, you are a, and then give them some 4 letters just off the bat. You, of course, want to cover that What do we mean by preferences? That was step 3. And then let's look at the MBTI preferences and have that client estimate which side they think they might prefer, looking at E and I, S and N, T and F, and J and P. And this is where I really love the introduction of the new MBTI Step 1 feedback cards. Again, this is your product to use as a practitioner. You don't give these cards to the client to take with them, but you do give these cards to the client to use during that feedback session where they get to hold on to something and they get to sort of look at various sort of, if you will, prompts and talking points that you can go over with them. Especially if you're new delivering feedback. Sometimes it's hard to come up with personal stories and questions to ask. And why I love these cards is because they give you those specific questions to ask, those specific questions to explore, and so on. So looking more specifically, staying with step 4, we're still on that self-estimate. Here's how you would walk somebody through the self-estimate for extroversion and introversion, where you see card 3 on the far left gives a basic description of what E and I are about. And then as you're walking through, having your client hypothesize their preference for E or I, you can focus on areas like action versus reflection, or ways of recharging, approach to meetings, preferred work environments, hobbies and interests. And then there are some questions you can ask to help your client then hypothesize which side that client thinks fits best for that person. Now you'll see on the back of each of these cards, we're still on step 4, there are some additional follow-up questions you can explore. And I think these are really crucial when you have that client who says, you know, I don't know, I do both all the time. By the way, for me, when a client says they do both all the time, that's a good sign, because all of us should use, in this case, E and I, every single day to be effective, productive people in work and in life. However, typically we can find one side that we prefer, and so these questions can help that client maybe focus in a little bit more around which side do they prefer versus which side they learn. And again, I love these cards because they give you everything you need to give that nice, basic 1-hour feedback session with a client. You don't have to remember what questions you're going to ask. In time, you'll get these down. You'll know the questions to ask, but especially early on, I think these cards are invaluable to have and valuable to use. Now, continuing with that self-estimate, we can go back into the Exploring a Myers-Briggs type workbook, and you can enter in on page 11. In fact, you can start putting in some of that self-estimate information. That's what you see on the far right of this page, or the far right of this slide, where you're entering in E or I. Now, if you're still not clear, you can write maybe slight, you can write moderate, you can write clear, and you can write very clear. Those of us who are certified know that's what we call the preference clarity categories: slight, moderate, clear, and very clear. And if you're still not sure, you can put a little X right there in the middle for people who aren't sure, because we do not want to box anybody into a decision. We want them in the end to ultimately decide which side they prefer, recognizing this is one part of the process. This is the self-estimate. We're going to add the reported type, of course, to help add to that whole process. And again, in the end, we are not labeling people. We are not putting labeled letters on people in the form of a tattoo in any way whatsoever. In fact, when we think about the goal of the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the goal is about gaining some understanding around how do we take in information and how do we make decisions. Isabel Briggs Myers described this as clear perceptions and sounder judgments. That's really what we're looking at with this tool. We're certainly not looking at labeling people in any form whatsoever. All right, so now step 5, we get to bring in the report. And it's not until this point that the report comes into play. Remember, we covered several other steps where we introduced what do we mean by preferences. We have our clients go through that self-assessment for E and I, S and N, T and F, and J and P. Once we do that, then we can bring in a report. And those of us who use the Myers-Briggs on a regular basis know there is a variety of reports. There are a variety of reports that are available to us. On screen, you're seeing the personal impact report. I like the interpretive report for organizations. There's the stress management report, the communication styles report. There are various reports available. Regardless of the report you use, it's really crucial when you get to step 5 to still encourage your clients to challenge this information. You don't want your clients to look at this info and say, well, my self-estimate was different than this, then this must be right. No, it's part of a process that we continue to explore. We continue to add. This, when you look at your reported results, represents another hypothesis, as you're seeing on the right side of this screen. It's a really good hypothesis based on good reliability, good validity. However, in the end, it's up to the client to decide what that client's best fit type truly is. I will say on step 5 is also a great opportunity for you as a practitioner to clarify what do we mean by preference clarity categories of slight, moderate, clear, and very clear. And what do we mean about information like the preference clarity index, which is a range from 1 to 30? What do those numbers mean? And it's really important that you clarify. Those numbers are not indicating strength or skill or ability. All those numbers and all those categories are telling us is how consistently you answer the questions on the instrument. That's all it's telling us. So as a practitioner, if you're my client and you report a very clear preference for extroversion, I would not say, oh, look, you're a very strong extrovert. That's completely incorrect. There's no such thing as weak or big or small or strong with the MBTI. And I will say, in my opinion, there's no such thing as an extrovert or an introvert anyway, because we all prefer extroversion or introversion. We're not a label of an extrovert or an introvert. I hope I get some questions about that, because I think it's an interesting thing to explore. Then we get to putting it all together, where hopefully you're at a place with the client where they can have some idea of their best fit type, and they can enter that in the workbook. They can also enter that in on page 7 of Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type. Some people might not be sure on 1 or 2 of their preferences. Again, it's perfectly okay, and you need to reassure a client that it's perfectly okay. So you need to be comfortable, of course, with that, remembering that, of course, we're not labeling people in any way. I will tell you what can help is then going back to Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type. Because if I have a client whose self-estimate happens to be ENFP, but the reported type is ESFP, what I have them do is go to both pages, ENFP and ESFP, and I have them hold 2 highlighters. I like yellow and pink because you can easily find yellow and pink. And what I would have them do to both pages, both ENFP and ESFP, is highlight in yellow everything they agree, and then in pink everything they disagree. Now, I don't want them to cross out anything they disagree. I want them to still see what they don't think fits them so they can challenge themselves, seek out people they trust, and get additional feedback. And if they're indifferent to any of the language, they just leave that part of the page blank. And that's one way to get somebody the best fit type, to see in the end which one do they ultimately agree. Now, there are many ways, of course, you can get somebody the best fit type. We're just looking at a refresher here. That's one of many ways. If you have additional questions related to that, please include them when we get to our question section, which we're going to get to soon. Now, as I said in the beginning, I'll say it now, I never want to have a client leave a feedback session, whether it's an individual feedback session, which is what we're focusing on now, or a group feedback session. I always want there to be some commitment to action. And what you're finding in the Exploring Your Myers-Briggs Type workbook is a great place to add in information related to what 3 things are you going to work on based on what we talked about today during our feedback of the MBTI. And I really emphasize 3. Now, you might have 20 things you want to work on, but if you're me and I have too much to do, I don't do anything because I get overwhelmed. So just 3 things at a time. And then if you want to come back, you can spend time and explore with me how you're doing on those 3 things. If you've tackled one of those 3, now you only have 2, then I would want you to add another one. So again, you're continuing to work on 3 things at a time so that your learning of type is a lifelong experience. It's not just you come in, we spend a few minutes, and then you move on from there. So why don't we open up some time, an opportunity to hear from anybody around what questions do you have about feedback, maybe what challenges you're facing, and I would love to hear any additional tips that anybody is willing to share with everybody else. So Kim, I'll open it up for questions, challenges, tips, of course.
Okay, great. So we do have a couple questions that have come through. The first question is, how long do your individual interpretation sessions typically last? And is there a generally accepted or optimal duration for effectiveness?
Yeah, it's a good question. I typically do a one-on-one feedback session in an hour. However, I won't back up my appointments because I don't want, when we get to 59 minutes and 59 seconds, say, great, that was fun, bye. I want to make sure I do leave some extra time. And then I want to also take a few notes about what that feedback session was like so that I have a reminder of what I'm going to cover the next time I work with that person. Now, typically it's an hour. I will say just about a month ago, I delivered step one feedback with somebody for a full day. It was a full day coaching session, and I will tell you, it was incredibly rich because we really got to get into how these preferences are helping this person, how this person's preferences are helping, and maybe how this person's preferences are not. And those are really good questions to ask in a feedback session. My preferences are for INFP, and if you're working with me, a good question might be, so how is introversion helping you in your work and in your life? But also, how might it not be? I wish I could claim credit for those questions. Those questions come to me from my mentor. Linda Kirby shared them with me years ago, and they have proved invaluable in feedback. But going back to the question, 1 hour, but of course you can go beyond that if you need to. Any other questions, comments, tips?
All right, so what are examples of 3 things clients are going to work on after the MBTI session?
So think of a recent feedback session I had with the client who, when we worked on how his preference for extroversion and introversion were helping him, we really got into how they were not, where he was maybe using too many words to explain something. And so one thing for him to work on was to understand that words in a way are like money. And when you're talking to somebody, think about how much money you actually have to get your point across before you lose them. And so a tip for him was just to work on being a bit more concise, being more to the point. Somebody else, a tip might be around, let's say I had somebody who had a preference for thinking, who had feedback that he wasn't connecting enough with his colleagues and with the people that reported directly to him. So one of his points might be, every day, think of 3 things or 2 things that he's going to provide in terms of feedback around how he appreciates what a colleague is doing or what a direct report is doing for him. You might have somebody like me who prefers intuition. A great thing I need to work on is being able to pay attention to what's right in front of me instead of being so focused on the future. I get so future focused, I miss what's right in front of me. That can be incredibly valuable to helping what's happening for me in the future. So it's going to depend on the person, and you'd be amazed in a feedback session what comes up, again, when you ask those questions. How are your preferences helping you, and how are they not? Other thoughts, comments, tips?
Yeah, so we have one from Andrea. I'm conducting sessions primarily by phone for my organizations. I forward the report right before the call. My challenge is once they see the reported type, they are not as interested in self-reporting. What is the process for phone delivery in your experience?
Hi, Andrea, and I actually do a lot of feedback over the phone. And before I answer your question, I do want to point out feedback over the phone is perfectly appropriate. Just be aware that sometimes when you're just a voice, people on the other end tend to share a little bit more than they naturally would. And so keep in mind, if you're not a psychotherapist, we're not turning you into one with the MBTI. Of course, it is used by psychotherapists, but they have that training to add to it. Now, in terms of the process, and this is a big one, and your question really, I can directly answer that. You never want to send that report even a minute before the phone call. So here's the process. The client takes the MBTI online. You get a notification that that person has taken the MBTI. You then set up a feedback session with them. In your feedback session, you want to be really clear that the client has access to the internet. So you get on the phone with the person. Let's say the feedback session is at 10 o'clock. You've only sent them their Introduction to Myers-Briggs type booklet in a PDF. You have not sent them the report. Now you start walking them through what do we mean by preferences. You have them sign their name with the preferred and non-preferred hand. Online, you walk them through the self-assessment. They enter that in on a piece of paper, anything they have in front of them. If they have their workbook in a print form, that would be great. Then and only then do you press send. That's when you send it. And you wait. It'll take a little bit of time. The person will say, I haven't gotten it yet. I'll just reassure them, don't worry, it's on its way. I'll check my outbox to make sure it did go. And then when it comes up, then we bring the report into the mix, but only then. What other thoughts, comments, tips does anybody want to share? Kim?
Yes, so Monica asked, are there people who just seem to not want to commit to a preference? They just agree with everything?
You know, there are people who might not want to commit. There are even people who might not even be interested in exploring the MBTI. Just be aware, if you follow the process, if you follow the steps, if you really study how to use this tool, you will do great work. Not everybody is ready for your great work. However, down the road, who knows, something you say in that feedback session with them today will click in a real life experience the next day or the next month or the next year. And who knows, maybe then they're really ready to come back to you. People who aren't ready to commit, it's actually okay, because what you're giving them are useful tools to get those clear perceptions and those sounder judgments. That's really all it's about, clear perceptions, sounder judgments, whether they're willing to commit or not. Now, keep in mind, it's not your role when people say, I don't know. Your role as a practitioner is not to say, well, we're out of time, so it's probably thinking. That's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to give them some ways to continue to explore. So if a person says, I don't really know about TRF, give them some homework to think about. You might ask them, over the next 3 days, try to make decisions just using thinking. And then the next 3 days, just using feeling as much as you can, and then come back and let's talk about what that was like. Or maybe talk to people they trust, people who know them well, to get some additional feedback to add to the mix. And I would even explore, what concerns they have about committing one side over the other. Often it's about not wanting to be labeled. And you can be really clear, I'm not here to label you, I'm here to help you understand this idea of preferences, recognizing regardless of our preferences, all of us bring something to every situation we're in, and all of us have potential blind spots. So let's try to look at it from that perspective instead. I think we have time for any more questions, comments.
Well, I'll have one more question before we move on to the next section. And this question is, have you ever used the MBTI with college students for career searching efforts? And if so, how do you use it? Which can be a loaded question, but if you're able to maybe summarize.
I think it's a great question, and I love the MBTI as part of the career exploration process. The big word was part of the career exploration process. I never use it alone. I would always use it with the strong interest inventory, because the Myers-Briggs is looking at those innate predispositions. The strong then looks at those vocational interests that maybe are part of those innate predispositions, but also a part of what you've learned over the course of your life. So adding it together can give you rich information that opens up opportunities instead of limits them. So quickly, I like the MBTI as part of that process, but never, ever, ever by itself. We're now getting into MBTI Step 2 feedback. Now, I want to point out again, we're going to just go through this in a few minutes. Learning how to deliver Step 2 feedback for people who haven't done this yet is part of the MBTI certification. In fact, in the U.S. certification, it's 4 days for Step 1 and Step 2. The 4th day covers how to deliver feedback with this version of the MBTI. All right, and again, there's a process that we need to think about. When we think about the process, you always want to check in again, and I'll cover these steps in just a minute. You want to revisit Step 1 type. You then introduce the Step 2 facets. You then discuss those client facet results, and I'm going to show you a nice new card deck that we have that will help you do that. You, of course, discuss how do these facet results, how do they help you, how might they not. There are some what I call coaching pages in the back of the Step 2 interpretive report. And then, of course, always, 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 there needs to be some commitment to some kind of action following any kind of feedback that you deliver with someone. So let's start with a few recommended tools that I would like to just cover. One is, on the far left, the MBTI Step 2 feedback cards. Now, with the MBTI Step 1, there are so many different resources that can help you. Step 2, there aren't as many, and so this new set of cards I think you're going to find really, really useful, because when you talk about facets, there's a lot more to memorize, there's a lot more to study. The cards give you what you need to cover, so again, you're covering those concise, clear points and maybe not saying more than you need to. The cards also include interesting questions you can ask, and I will show you what I mean when we get to the various steps in just a minute. there's also the Understanding Your MBTI Step 2 Results booklet. And I'm surprised that a number of people don't use this booklet. I use this just like I use Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type. What I mean is whenever I give Step 2 feedback, every client I work with gets this booklet. Because again, I'm going to cover a lot of information, but how much will they remember? Hopefully they're going to find the individual session with me useful. However, they need to then go back and spend time reflecting, maybe talking to other people about what that session was about, and this booklet will help them do that. So let's look at our steps and see where those resources might fit in. Of course, you always want to check in. You want to look at and explore how the MBTI Step 2 might add to learning about preferences. You want to ask questions like, what was it, what came up between our first session where we talked just about Step 1, and now here we are at Step 2, and so I would ask just additional thoughts, additional comments that came up from that previous session. And again, it's important to just check in to see where the client is. Is this even an appropriate time to give feedback? Is that client going through tough issues that would be hard for the person to really focus, really hard for that person to zone in on all the great information you're about to share with that person? All right, so check-in is crucial. Now, I talked a minute ago about revisiting Step 1 type. What I love about the resources we have, for example, the MBTI Step 2 Interpretive Report, page 3 lets you revisit that Step 1 type, where you see the person's Step 1 result. You see a nice overview of what do those Step 1 results mean. And then there's that graph. I mentioned it briefly earlier when we talked about Step 1. This graph covers what we call the preference clarity categories, and those categories are slight, moderate, clear, and very clear, and the preference clarity index, which is a range from 1 to 30. And it's crucial that you really are clear about what do these numbers and what do these categories mean. And it's really important that you do not overinterpret what these numbers and categories mean when you're giving both Step 1 and Step 2 feedback. So if you have a question about that, I'd love to answer it. Now you have the booklet as well, Understanding Your Step 2 Results. There's the booklet on the right, where you give a nice introduction, a reminder about Step 1 results, and then you can give a brief overview of 4-letter type. It's all here in the booklet. So again, you have good resources to help you, so you don't need to remember, what do I cover next? Now, Step 3, you get to introduce the facets. And you see on Step 3, the report will give you some of that info. And on the report, this is Step 3, but page 4 of the report, what's underlined represents the person's reported type. That's what's underlined here. Now, if your client says, after some thought, I don't really think these results fit me, can I have a report that's different from what you see here? You actually can go into the Elevate site and generate what's called a best fit type report. And I would recommend, even if clients are curious about another type, generate that, because while you pay for the first report, generating a best fit type report is actually free. You don't pay an additional amount. Now, you can only do that one time per client per report. However, it's a great opportunity for clients to explore, so they don't use this information as the end all, this must be me. You want to continue to encourage clients to challenge these results so they get to ultimately what fits them the most, what fits them the best. Now, once it's time to get into Step 2 facet results, you'll see Step 4, pages 5, 6, 7, and 8 will cover those facet results. Page 5 covers E and I, page 6, S and N, page 7, T and F, and page 8, J and P. These are the facet results, and if you're looking at the top of the screen, you're seeing some dots and some numbers. We need to remember, just like with the PCI and PCC for Step 1, these are just giving us information about consistency. You also get added information, however, in terms of whether your results are in preference, out of preference, or in the mid-zone. And you know that by finding the dot and just looking up, and it will say whether that result is in or out of preference or mid-zone. And what's nice is the cards on the right will give you some really good ways to explain what does that mid-zone result mean for the client, and have the client then address questions that the cards will let them cover. So what you're seeing with the MBTI Step 2 feedback cards are each of those facets And you're not seeing all the information, but you're seeing some interesting graphics that can help explain the facets, a few questions you can ask to help understand those facets, and so on. And so why don't we look at some of that by zoning in, focusing in just a little bit more by first looking at, this is E and I, and on the far left, this person reported a mid-zone result initiating and receiving. So I'm on the left side of the screen. Notice the dot is leaning to the right side, but because it's still in that mid-zone area, we would describe that as initiating, receiving. And if I go down on that same page, page 5 of the report, I will see ways to connect with others, initiating and receiving, and a few words that describe that facet result. So here again is where you want your client to have two highlighters. Yellow and pink I like because you can easily find them. And your client throughout the report, starting with this first facet result of initiating and receiving, they would then highlight what they think fits them and what they think doesn't. Because again, the client gets to ultimately decide what fits them and what doesn't. And it's crucial, especially with the MBTI step 2, that you encourage your client to challenge these results. Why I say that is because the step 2 report, there are more pages, there are more colors, you answer more questions. So sometimes people think, this must be me. However, it might not be based on what that client's mindset was. In fact, with the facets, there are actually relatively few items, 5 to 9 items per facet. And so you could, in some instances, answer just a few questions different and report, in this case, either out of preference or in preference. Now, same slide, but look over to the right. Here are the cards now that give you some questions to explore just this one facet result. At a social event, how comfortable are you introducing yourself to others? Typically, somebody in a mid-zone would say something like, it really kind of depends. Maybe it would depend on the kind of week that I had. If I had a week where I was in a room with 30 people all week long, I might actually look a little bit more on that receiving side. Or if I had a week where I was all by myself doing some research, I might, at that social event, look more like that initiating side fits me. And again, for that mid-zone, those are words you often hear. It depends. And what's nice is if the client isn't sure, you can just turn the card over, and you'll see the red box, mid-zone, is highlighted in red. Here's some additional points to sort of describe, and then let the client give you feedback about whether that fits or whether it doesn't. So again, now you have a good resource to add to your step 2 feedback sessions that you previously didn't have, and I really hope you'll consider looking at this more. Now, step 4 lets you go into that booklet again, understanding your step 2 results, and there are places to enter in exploring your facet results, understanding your out of preference results, and whether you agree with them or not, and what are the results, what's the result of those out of preference results. I think of I report out of preference on expressive. I shared earlier, my preferences are for INFP. So expressive is actually on the extroversion side, even though my overall preference is for introversion. And if I was your client and you were walking me through feedback, you would ask, do you agree with that result? I would say yes. And then you would ask me, why do you think you reported that way? And I would share a story around my mom. And if you go through MBTI certification, you'll hear that whole story about that's how my mom interacted with people, and it's something that I've learned. But it isn't necessarily who I am. It's just something that I've learned in certain situations. You'll see back to the slide looking at your mid-zone result, and you can write some notes there, and then exploring interesting facet combinations, and then discovering your uniqueness within your type. Now, what's great is as you're working through the workbook with your client, you're also moving through the report. And what I love about the step 2 interpretive report is if you start on page 3 where you're introducing step 1 type, reintroducing step 1 type, you just turn the page and what you need to cover next will magically appear. It's right there for you. So while we're giving you some steps here, the report will actually give you the steps you need, and then these additional resources will help to add sort of more flavor, more sort of meat, if you will, to that feedback session. We got the question earlier, how much time does it take to give a step 1 feedback session individually? Typically about an hour. With step 2, because there is more you cover, those feedback sessions tend to take an hour and a half. And just last week I did 3 in a row. I don't recommend it. It can be really exhausting, and some of them even got to 2 hours. So I would put in place 2-hour blocks so that you can really help that feedback session. It can be a richer experience if you add more time to that session. Now you'll see step 5 is really part of the whole process here, and the cards will help you explore benefits and blind spots with the client related to their facet results. So on step 1, I report accommodating. Under thinking and feeling, I report in preference accommodating. Here you're seeing, that last one, planful, open-ended. I actually report out of preference planful. So if I were your client, a really good question would be to ask, so how does that planful approach help you in your work and in your life, and how might it not? And I would share, well, recently I went to Disney World with my partner and my best friend, and at times I was maybe a bit too planful for the other two. And so I had to sort of tone it down, maybe just sort of go with the flow, work a little bit more open-ended. They also both prefer judging, I will say. However, my planful approach was even a little bit too much for them. And so there's where benefits and blind spots. How do your preferences help you, and how do they not? How do your facets help you, and how might they not? Really good questions to continue to explore, both with step 1 and with step 2. Now, the back of the report really gives you all that coaching content. So again, you're not just walking in one time, the client leaves, and you never see them again. These back pages are what I call the coaching reports, where you can look at areas related to communication, or making decisions, or managing change, or managing conflict. Now, a good tip to remember is when you're working with a client, don't overwhelm them with all of these pages. There's way too much information here. Instead, based on your time with that client, you'll have some idea of what you want to focus on. So maybe they want to focus most on communication and conflict. So put the other 2 pages aside, and starting with communication, sit that down in front of your client and let them highlight on the communication page which 3 facets they want to work on. Just 3, not all of those facets, because again, if you give somebody too much to do, they get overwhelmed with it. Now, if you look on the communication page, on the far left, you'll see the facet listed related to communication. In the middle of that column, that's how that communication style is sometimes seen related to that facet. And on the right-hand side are the coaching tips, how to enhance your communication style based on your facet results. So this gives you practical, real-world examples to help your client now explore how to improve communication, or make decisions, or manage change, or manage conflict. So again, good content. Don't overwhelm your client with all of it. It's way too much for one person to see, even in that 1.5-hour session. If you have a full day, maybe it would be something you would work with them on, but that's plenty. And then again, at the end of it all, there's where the individual commitment to action comes into place, where, as I mentioned a moment ago, just have your client focus on 2 points, not the entire page, so they don't get overwhelmed with all of it. All right, so I'm sorry, 1, 2, or 3 points, not all of these points. That's plenty to work on. And then they can come back. Let's say I'm your client and I'm working on that intimate, understanding that relying on yourself or a few trusted others in resolving the conflict, that can sometimes work for me. But how it might not work is when I don't widen my circle enough to include others affected, and they may have something valuable to contribute, I'm losing those contributions. So that would be one of the 3 things I would commit to in my individual commitment to action. Again, crucial as part of feedback. All right, it's now time to hear a few more questions, comments, and tips, of course.
Yes, I have another set of great questions, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So the first question is from Tenora. Is it true that with step 2, the graphs are also indicating the degree of a preference as well as consistency in response?
Yeah, there's where it gets tricky, because if we start to assume that step 1 and step 2, that those numbers and graphs are including the degree of use, then we're over-interpreting the results. Instead, we want to ask the client. If the client reports in preference for accepting, we want to ask the client, do you agree? And if the client says yes, then we just go back to how does it help you, how does it not? Again, it's just in preference, whether it's a 2, 3, 4, or 5, just in preference, not degree of, not amount of use. The client would tell you more information. We cannot assume that.
All right. Do you recommend separating step 1 and step 2 interpretation sessions?
I do, and I do again. Imagine you go through an hour on step 1 and then we jump right into step 2. I haven't given that client time to reflect on it if they prefer introversion, or to talk to other people that are important to them if they prefer extroversion. And guess what? Both people who prefer E and I need to reflect and need to talk. So I want to separate it out. I mentioned I recently delivered a step 1 feedback session for a full day. We did do the step 2 the very next day. However, we spent some time at dinner talking a little bit about step 1, and then that client had some time on his own to reflect on it as well. And so that was okay. Ideally, I would want maybe a couple of days, a week. I've delivered step 1 and step 2 a year apart with one person. That might be a little too much, but definitely I would not recommend one after the other. Now, sometimes circumstances require it, but if you can get some time, I would recommend it.
All right, Michael, it seems that you are comfortable in using words like clear preference versus a strong preference. Is that correct? How would you respond to a client if they said, oh, I'm not very strong in extroversion?
Yeah, that relates to what the MBTI is truly all about. The MBTI is about preferences, not about traits. And so once we start using words like strong and weak, suddenly we're applying trait language to the MBTI. Instead, all the results are really giving us is how consistently you answered the results. And so that's why currently we're using words like slight, moderate, clear, and very clear. And for the facets, we're using words like in preference, out of preference, and mid-zone. And we're trying to get away from using how big or how small a preference is. The MBTI doesn't have questions that give us that information anyway. So there's where we have to be really careful. And I know a number of people, this might be new, and it might be new more specifically to people who are educationally qualified, because in certification we really, really emphasize the importance of using proper language and exploring results in a proper way in terms of, you reported a slight preference for introversion. Does this fit you, does this not? And then letting the client tell you how that preference fits and how it doesn't, and whether or not the client agrees or not.
All right, Judith has a question. How can I better clarify that F and T are both rational processes? I find it difficult to explain feeling so that clients don't confuse it with emotions. Using the word value with feeling but not with thinking seems to be to cause confusion in some. Can you offer more descriptors for feeling that steer clear of that misunderstanding?
Yeah, you know, that one comes up quite a bit, that idea. People who prefer thinking are always rational, and people who prefer feeling are irrational or emotional. And I just remind people that it isn't about how emotional you are. In fact, I know somebody who will assume, oh, you prefer feeling, that must mean you cry all the time. I know somebody whose dominant function is extroverted feeling who rarely cries. So it's not really about that. It's about how do we make our decisions. And so you might think about words like objective on that thinking side, subjective on that feeling side. And I will tell you, I don't shy away from that word values. I really think it resonates quite a bit. It's my preference. Maybe that's why I don't shy away from it. I will be really clear with people, however. Sometimes people will assume because I prefer feeling that they can step all over me because I'm so worried about offending people. And I will say I'm pretty easygoing. However, if you step on my values, guess what? You have stepped on a rattlesnake, and it will get ugly, and I will walk you into a corner, and I can stand up for myself just as much as anybody who prefers thinking. But it's just sort of a different motivator that gets me there.
Okay, great. And Barbara asks, how do you talk about type dynamics, dominant and auxiliary preferences?
Barbara, that's a really good question, and I will actually introduce type dynamics in an individual feedback session if the opportunity comes up. However, I stay away from words like type dynamics, which right away scares people, and I stay away from words like dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior. Instead, I would use words like your favorite, maybe even the heartbeat of your type, and I'll pound on my chest just like I'm doing now, and then give some examples related to that. A great way to explain all of this goes all the way back to Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type, the workbook. Because if you're on somebody's page, if you're on my INFP page, on the left-hand side, if you go down near the bottom, there's a blue band. The left-hand side, it will show first, second, third, and fourth. That's dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, and inferior. And if you want to explain what that means, in that page, there's a section titled Characteristics of, and you're going to see two sets of bullets. The first set of bullets describes the favorite or the dominant. And then you can ask that client questions about whether or not it fits or not. And when you focus on that information, you really get the buy-in from the client, because it's much more meaningful than just looking at E and I separately. It's much more meaningful to understand, oh, well, let's see, you extrovert intuition, using the word extrovert as a verb because I don't believe in it as a noun. You extrovert intuition when you're taking in information. And I would say to you, yeah, that's why sometimes people assume I prefer extroversion, which I don't. It's just when I'm taking in information, I do. However, when I make a decision, I introvert that, and I need some time to step away from a situation to really get ready to make a decision. It's why sometimes people assume I'm indecisive. I'm not. It's just I'm not sharing that decision with a lot of other people. So back to the question, you can touch on it. Just stay away from the jargony words. Stay away from dominant, tertiary. I can't even say that word well. So just stay away from those words, and you can introduce it.
All right, so Wendy asks, what does it mean when the number of questions answered for one preference is higher, but then the report indicates the other preference when the higher number of questions answered is in the other preference?
I'm not sure I'm getting the question. Is that about having more facets on the opposite side of the overall preference?
Well, I'll see if Wendy can type in maybe some clarifying around that. So I will go on to the next question in the meantime.
And really quick, before you do, Kim, it could also be the result of somebody reporting a certain type but verifying on the opposite side. So let's say I report a preference for INTJ, but I really think INFP fits me, and so my report will show one thing, but my verified type will show something else. That could be it as well. Sorry to interrupt.
All right. Well, Wendy just replied yes, so I think we did answer her question there. So thank you, Wendy. Okay, so we have a question here from Andrew. How do you explain that step 2 results remain even if the verified step 1 type is different than reported results?
Yeah. So let's say somebody takes step 1 and they report a preference for ENFP, and when it's time to go for step 2, you can go into the site and there's a button that shows all of the preferences. They all will come down, and then you can click on the one that person now verifies for. Now what's interesting is the facet results further on now will be described different. Let's say the person reported thinking, they verify feeling. Now when they get to page 7 of the step 2 interpretive report, how those facets are described will be different, because now you get that differentiator. You're no longer in preference, you're now out of preference for that facet. I'm not sure I completely answered that question, so please feel free to add on to that if you'd like, and I'll try to address it a little bit better.
Okay, and Anne has asked, how many sessions do you typically have with a client?
That's a good question, and I like ongoing sessions. However, I know time and money is an issue, so it's common that I'll have at least 2 with someone. Sometimes I'll have 3 or 4. This past week, I delivered a group feedback session with an organization. So we did group work related to type and teamwork and communication. And then I had a one-on-one session with 3 members of that team. I would love to get follow-up work with all of them, and I'm hoping that will happen down the road. So 1, hopefully 2, and then if I can, I like having ongoing work with people if they're open to it.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and I think it's from Cassie here, who maybe needs a little more clarification. If a person completes step 1 and is ENFP, yet best fit is ESTP, do you use ESTP for step 2?
Oh, yeah. Now, I can. Now, they have to have answered all of the questions to get that information. And so a really good tip for everybody if you're not doing this, I would highly recommend it. Whenever you use the MBTI and you have people take it online, just give everybody Form Q. Don't use Form M because Form Q has all the information you need. It has the 93 items that give you step 1 results, and then it has the additional 51 items that add into the facets for step 2. And so if I'm working with somebody, I generate a report from Form Q, that's the longer version, I can generate a step 1 report from that. If they don't agree with those results, when it's time for step 2, I just go right in, I click on a button that shows all of the 16 types, and then I click on the one that they prefer. However, they had to have answered all of the questions to get that step 2 information.
All right, well, unfortunately, I think we've run out of time, but want to thank everyone for attending and asking so many excellent questions.
Thanks, everybody.